Yeah, just very briefly. Oops. Okay. Just very briefly, want to share a little bit about Veggie Mijas before my amazing team members dive into the rest of the presentation. So, Veggie Mijas essentially started in 2018 as a small collective, specifically folks coming together on a college campus. Our founder, Amy Kichis, came together with other students to just, find ways to be able to reconnect with other folks and to stay true to their cultures while starting to navigate more of a plant-based alternative lifestyle in a predominantly white institution. So the mission of Ejimijas is essentially to make plant-based living accessible to global majority women and gender expansive people while empowering them to embrace foodways that are rooted in ancestral traditions. Our goal is essentially to just be able to support folks in reclaiming our culture, the foods that we grew up eating, and living in a way of, cultural preservation and collective power. We do this through a variety of ways. We have chapters throughout the US. Some are more active than others, but Chicago is one of our chapters. They're representing us here today. We have chapters in Philly and DC and New York City and Orlando and some on the West Coast as well. They're a bit less active right now, but have done amazing work throughout the years. A lot of the work that we do is through community workshops, community potlucks. We have a plant-based community fridge in Chicago, which I know our team will be sharing a little more on throughout the presentation. We have a garden in our Philly chapter that we come together and teach folks about, seed starting and planting and how to just grow our own food and essentially going back to the mission of food and land sovereignty and just being able to have that power of growing our own food, knowing what we're growing, knowing where our food is coming from and, what we're putting into our bodies. We also do this through, different ways of community and educational programming. So we have different educational workshops. We try to do workshops in the community and gardens, as well as schools and community centers, as well as libraries. And yeah, essentially, it's just all about community building, connecting ourselves to our food and our culture. A lot of mutual aid efforts as well, cooking demos, different panels. And yeah, it's just a way to remind folks that we can continue to be on this journey of, fighting for food and land justice while being at the front of it. I think a lot of us that are here are probably very used to just seeing, like just very whitewashed veganism and in a way that erases our culture and erases who we are. So it's important to be able to reclaim that for ourselves and be at the front of it. So yeah, very excited to be here again. And Danny will share a little bit more about the Chicago chapter specifically. And shout out to, I saw M is here. Shout out to M, one of our team members from the Philly chapter, and anyone else that's here from our team. Thank you so much for showing up.
Yeah, thank you for that, Estefania. So just to share a bit more about what we do on a more local Chicago level, here we focus a lot on programming that consists of collaborative food events, such as cooking demos, cooking classes, potlucks. We also partner with local chefs and food rescue organizations and local farms. Like Estefania mentioned, we manage a plant-based community fridge in the Little Village neighborhood. It's on the corner of 25th Place San Francisco, which is right next to Cook County Jail, and it's accessible 24 hours a day. We also have a partnership with the Groove Chicago Yoga Studio, where we have monthly plant-based sandwich club, and we just make a ton of sandwiches and distribute them to the community fridges, the love fridges, and our own plant-based fridge. And then, yeah, we'll continue to talk a bit more about what we do and how you can get involved if that's of interest to you. But now I'll pass it over to Gary.
Thank you. So let's begin with the question, why decolonize our plate in the first place? Why are we gathering here today? And so for me, at the core of this work, it's thinking about how we can, through reconnecting to our ancestral foods, think about restoring harmony with the earth, reconnecting back with the land, and knowing where our food comes from, as Stephanie was saying, especially to remembering how our ancestors prepared it and how it was shared as well. Whether we're conscious of this or not, I think many of us are deeply, especially right now, feeling this sense of disconnection whether that's from ourselves, from the land, from culture, from tradition. And so that separation did not happen by chance. It developed over centuries through colonization and economic systems that prioritize extraction versus reciprocity. And so we want to name that. For me, as Dani mentioned earlier, we're talking from a perspective of our own backgrounds. And so for me, that's a Mesoamerican diaspora as a Mexican American daughter of immigrants, and also someone who has been studying the history of Latin America, especially as it relates to colonization and our relationship to the US. So that is kind of the context that we're coming from in sharing this history. It's important to understand. So across the Americas in the 15th century, colonization drastically reshaped our food systems. Our land was taken, indigenous communities were displaced, labor was reorganized to focus produce or crop production for global markets rather than local nourishment for nourishment of the community in the land. During this time, we saw a heavily kind of reliance in exploitation of Africans specifically, and also the indigenous people of this land, establishing plantation economies, especially focusing on sugar production in the Caribbeans, and then that spread to other food industries like coffee, cacao, etc. It's important to know during this time, specifically in Latin America, slavery had increased pretty quickly and drastically to 90% of the estimated 10 to 15 million Africans that were trafficked. So really grounding in that history and that disruption, not only to the people of this land, but the other folks and the labor that resulted in. For folks that are curious about kind of diving deeper and understanding that history more, I definitely recommend Open Veins of Latin America. It's a really good book. I will share it's a little bit heavy. It really talks about, the violence and disruption that colonization had across the Americas, but it's really great history. Another time in history where our food systems were significantly disrupted was during the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and 19th century. This was a time where there was a big introduction of large-scale agriculture to produce food at a mass at a global scale for convenience, for shelf life. There was more machinery being introduced. And then in more recent, in the 1980s, we saw a big rise of highly industrialized food systems focusing on ultra-processed foods. And again, convenience, marketing, corporations, and profit at the center of that. To then kind of seeing that, what's like almost 50 years now, seeing the connection in research, connecting diet-related diseases and our cultural disconnection, and kind of seeing that manifest in different ways for us, and even how currently we're navigating food systems. And then to just understand the importance, I have this quote of like why it is important to reclaim our foodways and kind of the possibilities of, reclaiming our culture, our health, and connection to community, is this quote that I have on this slide. It's by a Woroni leader, environmental activist from Ecuador. Her name is Nemonte. She protects the forest from big oil companies. And so this quote, she says, "In all these years of taking from our lands, you have not had the courage or the curiosity or respect to get to know us." For me, this quote invites us to reflect on what it looks like if we shifted our relationship with the land from extraction, from what it could provide to us, to reciprocity. And so I just kind of want folks to sit with that throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So, once we begin to answer this question, I think we can think about, in this slide, I want to set a bit more context of what our Mesoamerican food systems looked like prior to colonization, and then comparing them to what they looked like after colonization, after, the Spanish or the Spain influence imposition. And I do want to like emphasize, colonization and imposition, because these changes that happened, they did not happen voluntarily. They were forced upon, and there was no consent. And I think it's really important to like hold that and name that here, especially when we're seeing similar dynamics playing out right now. So before colonization, many Mesoamerican food systems centered biodiversity, diversity in general, seasonal eating, collective stewardship of the land. We had staple foods that included maize, bean, and squash. So many of us know that as the Three Sisters. We also have other foods like cacao, chia, amaranth nopales, to name a few. There was oftentimes systems like milpa, where crops would grow in an intentional way, and there was intentionality around how the crops can support each other, how they can support the soil health and the health of the people, and also the animals, insects. Labor was communal. Many communities practiced a tradition called tejido, where folks shared responsibility of taking care of the land and food production. There wasn't a lot of like centralization around like money and profit. It was a lot of bartering, exchanging. Food wasn't just seen as something that was for nutrition, for energy, but it was also, again, ceremonial, relational, spiritual. There was a deep gratitude for the food, the land, and all the processes involved. Then we compare that to when Spain came and introduced their models, their values. We saw a big shift from agriculture being diverse to being more focused on monocrops, really depleting the soil of life in all these ecosystems. We saw more focus on like livestock, private land, and these labors of servitude, of debt, putting people into debt and having to like work with their labor, slavery. Europeans also saw food as a symbol of status and hierarchy, where they framed European foods as more civilized, desirable. Again, this goes to that narrative that colonizers create, is like that separation, the good versus bad, which then is kind of like ironic when we look at history and we see our foods being labeled as superfoods, and kind of the history and like honoring where the roots of where that food comes, and in this process then food becomes inaccessible to our communities. So it's like a little bit ironic there. Some of the foods that they introduced during this time was a lot of wheat. So we saw the rise of wheat tortillas around this time, shifting away from our traditional corn tortillas, more refined sugar. So kind of going away from agave and these natural sugars that exist. A more focus on meat and animal consumption, so meat and dairy. And just a little add on here was a little ironic. When I turned vegan 10 years ago, my family was kind of like joking and offended, like, oh, you're not Mexican anymore, like you're not eating like us. And so it's a little bit ironic to then know this history and be like, oh, actually I'm eating most like our ancestral diet. But I know that's like a lot of information, and so I invite folks to, in the chat, we're really curious for folks to maybe share one traditional food practice that your family or you yourself have lost and has shifted. And so, yeah, I invite folks to do that in the chat. And then in the meantime, as people share their responses, I do want to share one example for me, specifically something that I lost and was thinking about was the preparation of frijoles. And so for me, growing up, it was very common for my mom to have like an olla, a pan of frijoles, just kind of cooking, ready for the week for myself and my siblings. And even that process was like a slower process, more intentional process. And so for me, now I think about, like convenience, like I've been using canned beans. And that's something that I was reflecting on recently, where I'm like, okay, I think I want to like reconnect to that. That piece, because it's like these little things that we kind of start losing that connection to the land. But let me see what people have been putting in the chat. Okay, if I I don't know if Dani or Estefania, if you all have a specific thing you want to like highlight here as well from personal. If not, it's
Yeah, I
okay.
think one thing that comes to mind for me, and maybe not as specific to like Colombia, but just in general to our culture, is just, just the practices of like seed saving, seasonal harvesting, seasonal planting. I think you included the Three Sisters planting method in here as well. But just I think all of the things that go into just like how we're growing our food, saving those seeds, compost and just like working with the soil. I think all of those things have also been deeply forgotten and erased, intentionally.
Beautiful. Thank you. And now I'm seeing, sorry, I'm like navigating all the tech. I realized I have different chat. And so I'm seeing people in the chat cooking over fire outdoors. My aunt used to pick vegetables in the farm in Indiana. Now the land has turned mainly into big box stores. Pressing the tortillas. Beautiful. Thank you. Keep sharing. And then I'll hand it over to Dani for the next slide. Thank you.
So in this slide, we're gonna dive a bit into the different terminology that we hear and we're often familiar with. Different terms like vegetarian, vegan, and plant-based. They might sound familiar to folks and they're often used interchangeably too, but they don't come from the same histories and values. Some originated during European health reform movements, while others developed later as ethical or lifestyle frameworks around animal exploitation. Not all plant-based practices come from the same history. So some come from consumer culture, some come from ancestral survival and land relationships. Approaches like intersectional veganism and indigenous veganism often ask us to think about think about food beyond just what we eat. They connect our food choices to broader issues like justice and land relationships, labor, culture, community. So understanding these words can help us see that food isn't just about diet. It's also about identity. It holds history and the systems, tells us about the systems that we're a part of. Okay, next slide, please, Lina. So when we talk about Western veganism versus indigenous veganism, we're looking at two different ways of understanding food. One framework tends to treat food as a lifestyle choice, something that we individually manage through personal ethics, health goals, or our consumer decisions. And many of us were probably introduced to veganism through a Western lens that disregards things like identity, culture, community, and also accessibility. Western veganism blames the individual for their choices, and it really thrives on shame and guilt and social pressure, particularly around dieting and body image. It tends to promote body shaming. And in contrast, indigenous perspectives often frame food as a relationship that's tied to the land, the community, ceremony, and responsibility to other living things. That means that food choices aren't just individual, they're connected to the ecosystems, cultural knowledge, and collective care. The key distinction here isn't simply different diets, but different like worldviews. Food as a product that we choose versus food as a relationship that we participate in. Next slide, please. So before we move into solutions, we want to pause and clarify what people mean when they say processed foods. That term often gets used in a really simplified way, as if all processed food is bad, and that's not necessarily the case. But in reality, food processing exists on a spectrum, and most of the food that we eat is processed in some way because of the current food system that we live in, that we did not necessarily opt into. Minimally processed foods are foods that are still very close to their natural form. Things like dried beans, frozen vegetables, or chopped produce in a bag. Then we have culinary ingredients like oil, salt, flour, or sugar ingredients that we use to cook and prepare meals. There are also processed foods, which combine whole foods with those ingredients to extend the shelf life. Examples include bread, tortillas, canned foods, and these are great for emergency preparedness, which can be especially helpful during the diabolical times that we're living through right now. So yeah, some emergency preparedness could really these foods could really assist with that. The category that we're most concerned about is ultra processed foods. So these are industrial formulations made mostly from refined ingredients, additives, preservatives, and chemical flavorings. Things on a label you can't really define. It usually consists of a long list of ingredients that are hard to read. They're designed for primarily long shelf life. So things that last a few years and are tailored for convenience and profit rather than nourishment. So research shows that diets high in ultra-processed foods, such as products containing high fructose corn syrup, refined starches or artificial additives and preservatives, are linked to higher rates of inflammation, metabolic illnesses, and chronic disease. But it's really important for us to reiterate here that there is no room for shame in this conversation. Unfortunately, we live in a profit-driven food system that often takes the wheel behind our food choices. And on the next slide, we're going to focus on understanding that many communities were pushed toward these foods because of food access, time constraints, policies, economic pressures, and the way that our food systems were designed. So ultimately, understanding how these foods are produced helps us to make more informed choices when we can. And it also helps us to see why reclaiming whole, culturally rooted foods can really be part of our ultimate health.
Thank you. That's a great transition. We've touched, this is a great visual. I think for myself, I'm a visual person, so I like to process information in that way. And so some of these things on this slide, on this pyramid, we've already been touching on, but it's really important to understand, the larger structural systems that are at play and really influencing what food ends up, on our physical plates. To what Dani was saying, a lot of times we are made to feel that our food choices are very individual and it's up to us, and that brings a lot of shame and guilt. But in reality, as we're learning here and as we're seeing in this pyramid, it's really shaped by a lot of history of intentional oppression, colonization, economic, political systems, and policies. And so when we look at the top, these are the root systems, the things that influence our current society. So we have capitalism, we have colonization, white supremacy. You can include the patriarchy, et cetera, all these things. As some folks know, they're influencing all the other things. And so that influences who has access to land, who is performing the labor in this space, who is profiting from food production, distribution. So we can kind of begin to understand these things when we look at it in this way. And then in the middle layer, what are the structural impacts? How are we seeing these things kind of come about? We have things like food apartheid, through these different systems, through these policies they're creating and maintaining, and often a lot of times exacerbating these disparities to access healthy, affordable, culturally appropriated food. We see labor exploitation, we see the theft of land, displacement, migration. When we think about specifically our history and labor exploitation, it is very tied to agriculture. In the US, for example, we had programs like El Bracero program during World War II that brought Mexican laborers to work on the railroads, but also a lot of in agriculture, in a lot of times in very exploitative conditions. And a lot of our food systems right now do rely on immigrant labor. And so it's interesting to see what challenges and shifts we're going to be seeing in that space because of ICE and even just the increase of automation and robots and AI. But all these things are kind of impacting at that level. And then we go to the bottom of the pyramid where we kind of see those direct outcomes play out in our individual lives and in our communities. So when we think about diet-related diseases, the cultural disconnection, the loss of this traditional food knowledge, we begin to see those at the bottom and kind of trickle in, whether we're like aware of those connections or not. For me, as a person that's like holistic health, I like to kind of think about, you know, how our bodies, our spirits, you know, our mind is being impacted. And so on the side, kind of building out on the bottom part of the pyramid, you know, multiple parts of our lives are impacted. So as, you know, we've been mentioning the higher rates of like diabetes, heart disease, things that we can prevent through diet. And a lot of those rates are higher in our communities, in Black and Brown communities. When we look at, and then even to inflammation, because it's not just about food too, all these other things too are creating a lot of stress. And there's a lot of research too that stress is impacting our overall health. When we think about culture, the loss of these traditional agricultural knowledge, I think for myself and maybe many folks on the call, I've been kind of in a cycle of just like deeply grieving. You know, there was a time where it was second nature to like know how to grow, know how to prepare things. Things were in a more balanced kind of way centered with love and gratitude versus kind of how our systems are now. Again, that intentional reliance that has been conditioned in us to depend on these food systems. So potentially now, even if we think about like with what's happening, if there's a disruption in like our global food systems, like do we feel prepared, you know, to support ourselves? And I think myself and many folks don't feel that. And so even that kind of like anxiety and stress and holding that. And then we think about spirit and how our ancestors, again, had that connection with the land. There was ceremony. There was more balance around that. And so we wanted to take some time to highlight that. Another point of reflection for folks in the chat, if you want to engage, is how are you seeing these systems showing up in your neighborhood? How are they impacting you directly? We would love to kind of see what comes up for folks as it relates to that question. And if not, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I see someone putting, it's interesting when we think about, you know, these rules and stuff. We have so much food waste. I don't want to say probably not just the country, but the world. And yeah, it being illegal to like, you know, redistribute that or to get it from the dumpsters, having access to healthy seeds, you know, ownership of seeds is wild too. Yeah, we're starting to see a lot of these wealthy people trying to buy land, seeds. So it's interesting. All the fast food options, very little grocery, fresh food access. Yes, thank you all. On the next slide, thank you. Again, kind of revisiting now with more information and some context, again, revisiting the question of like, you know, why decolonize our diet? And I think emphasizing again, when we say decolonizing our diet, it's not necessarily we want to create these rigid rules and, you know, recreate the past exactly as it was or following a perfect diet. I think we can fall back into that mentality of like white supremacy and colonization where it's like, oh, it has to be this way. I think it's about kind of figuring that out for ourselves, our communities, and really thinking about just reconnecting that relationship with food, with land, with rhythms, our own rhythms, nature's rhythms, community, and really thinking about when we do reconnect with our ancestral foodways, we're reconnecting with that knowledge that sustained our communities, our ancestors for generations. And so I think that's really even important for us to think about as we navigate these times, as we kind of take care of ourselves, our communities. How are we using these foods to really deeply nourish us? You know, these foods that are coming from the earth, especially the root vegetables, how we might be using them for support during this time. And just to briefly kind of recap too, in decolonizing our diets, we're reconnecting to our culture, we're rebringing that to the present times, we're protecting those recipes, that history that colonization tried to erase. We're supporting our health, our community's health, by rooting into whole plant-based, nutrient-dense foods, foods that are alive and rich. We're helping rebuild these relationships, as we're talking about land, seeds, these ecosystems, and that in itself is a form of resistance and preserving life for the future generations. And then lastly, I think a lot of the things we've been talking about is the big players kind of creating our current rules and structures is the government, is these big global corporations. And so, as we begin to decolonize our diet and divest from these big corporations, we're able to redirect that money, those funds, that energy to support smaller local farms. Especially when we think about Chicago, there's so many urban farms here, small food businesses, community food initiatives, mutual aid, and giving that power back to the communities. I think that at its core, it's like redistributing and shifting the power back to our hands. And then just before I transition, just sitting with this quote around decolonizing our diets means honoring the wisdom of our people and restoring our right to grow, to heal, to cook, and to share food rooted in love, justice, and collective care. And I will say having that be the norm, the standard, and like a human right that is protected for everyone. That is kind of for me how I envision the future when we do center our ancestral foods. I will pass it over to Dani. Next
Yeah,
slide.
I just want to say thank you all for keeping the chat alive. I'm having a hard time like not wanting to respond to everyone. These are some really great points that you all are sharing. So thank you so much. I really hope that more connections are made after the presentation. So in this slide, here are some examples of ancestral foods, and I'd really like to highlight the foods that appear across many ancestral traditions like plantains, beans, squash, cacao, and corn. These foods come from different regions, like the indigenous communities of Turtle Island, Mesoamerica, and Afro-Indigenous Caribbean traditions. The overlap reflects generations of migration and trade and cultural exchange as well. So our ancestors understood that food is medicine. These foods were part of healing traditions and relationships with the land, and they nourished communities long before industrial food systems. For example, some nourishment that we get from some of these foods are like beans support our gut and heart health because they're rich in fiber and plant protein. Squash provides vitamins that support immunity and vision. Plantains, they offer complex carbohydrates and potassium that support steady energy and muscle function. And cacao contains antioxidants that support heart and brain health. So eating seasonally and locally really helps us to honor the land. However, we know that this can often be difficult, but not impossible. So maybe this is a good time to plug in starting that windowsill garden or getting involved in your local community gardens. I myself have, I live in an apartment in a big building. I don't have a backyard, but I have a compost bin that turns on my porch, and I'm able to have like a small greenhouse that I can grow like tomatoes and chiles, and that's what I can do. And I really encourage y'all to find ways to grow your own food. So another thing that eating seasonally and locally can support is digestion and blood sugar balance, and all while strengthening our connection to traditional foods. I'd also just like to pose a question here for the chat. So as you look at these foods, think about one food from your own culture. Who taught you to eat it, and what memories do you have of that? Um, for me, I would say like one of the big ones is like it's mm, it's gordo lobo. I actually didn't. I think it's called like mulling, or I don't know. That's what it is in English. But
Yes.
gordo loco was something that my mom gave us a lot when we were kids because we had asthma. I mean, probably a bunch of of us living here in the city, especially in communities that are highly polluted. We would have like respiratory issues, and we would drink a lot of gordo lobo teas. But it's, with time, I think those things kind of also like fade, or people, now you can go to the store and buy Theraflu and things like that that just replace those herbs and practices that take time, but really just do a better job, I think, overall for our systems. Um, yeah, I got the logo fans in the chat. For sharing okra, okra, so delicious. Yeah, please keep sharing in the chat. Um, and then I'll pass it over to you, Gary.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, please keep sharing. I know I like have ADHD, so I'm like briefly close to chat, but I love seeing all the activity there, and just like all the foods that are medicine for you all. And that was a good transition, Dani, to this slide, herbs as allies. So I don't know, I don't think I shared this in my intro, but I'm also an herbalist. So I couldn't like help myself in not bringing our plant allies to the conversation in the same way our ancestors saw food as medicine, they saw plants as medicine. And not only when we're sick, but like our overall part of our everyday life, our nourishment, our care. They also saw plants as teachers, and so really spending time and observing them. Some examples that we included here, aposote, which Dani, you mentioned earlier, it supports digestion, especially in combination with like beans. I know some people like beans can be a little bit harsh, so even that combination can help ease the digestion and absorption of minerals. We have jamaica, which supports circulation, hydration. Yerba buena, that can help our stomach, our nervous system. And then we have canela, that can support our blood sugar balance. And so before I share a little bit more, I invite folks in the chat to share, an herb ally that you have, or one that maybe you used growing up that has strong roots in your family. Would love to see that. For me, I included this as well because when we think about, herbs aren't just like good for us, they don't just taste good, but I think it's also, for me at least, it was an invitation to reconnect back with myself, especially during a time of severe burnout. I connected with plants at my local community garden in 2020 during the pandemic, and so for me specifically, the one that I worked with was stingy nettle. That was my first plant friend. She really brought me, for folks that are familiar with stingy nettle, very rich in like minerals, like protein. And so she really brought, much needed vitality to my life, and protection with boundaries and kind of care, and just like filled not only my physical body but spirit, and just even experiencing that for myself and what that inspired. I think that's like the power of plants, not only physically helping us but even energetically, spiritually as well. On here, the one with the yellow flowers is ruda, rue, and that also is a deeply spiritual, protective, and cleansing herb. And so there's just a whole kind of kingdom of knowledge and medicine out there. And so I definitely invite folks to lean into that and explore that. As we think about even transitioning to spring right now, the big focus is bitters, and kind of those cleansing detox herbs to really support our liver and help us move a lot of that stagnation and heaviness of winter. And so for me, that's kind of how I practice herbalism in this spiritual kind of seasonal way. I will say, I have to emphasize, I am not a doctor. So even these herbs that we mentioned, for the most part, these are safe, but definitely consult your healthcare provider, especially if you're pregnant, breastfeeding, or taking medication, and definitely doing your research as well. These medicines are powerful. Let me take a look. I don't know, Stefania or Dani, if you want to add anything else, but I'm going to take a look at the chat to see what people are saying. Nice. A lot of nettles too, rose, sage, and yes, the weeds. Yeah, I think that's like another, to make a plug, one of the ones that's going to start popping everywhere right now is dandelion, and how we've been conditioned to be like, oh, like that's a weed, and we even spray it with like these heavy chemicals. And then now as an adult realizing, I'm like, oh, like that dandelions are such a powerful medicine for the liver, for even just digesting and processing a lot of just like anger and heavy emotions. And even like these weeds, they like grow through very like rough like terrain, and even like a plant that can do that on its own, like it has a similar effect on our body as well. So I love that. We can go to the next slide. Beautiful. So again, I'm like a visual person in how I understand and process information. So I wanted to do this Venn diagram for you all. As someone who is in the holistic wellness space, I kind of think about how things are being impacted from this holistic way, our body, mind, and spirit. And so one of the things that I said earlier about, the power of decolonizing our plate, part of that too is kind of decolonizing our health and reimagining what that could look like, especially when we look at our ancestors and their indigenous practices of relating to our bodies to health. It's very relational, it's very interconnected, and a lot of it goes back to like the land, our ancestral foods. Versus I think when we think about what Western medicine or how medicine is practiced now, it's very like isolated, very internal. And so for me, I think that's also like the power of, reimagining collective care and these systems of health that are rooted in ancestral intelligence. So specific things that we can do to support our body in our health is eating warm, whole foods rooted in our culture, moving our bodies after meals, listening to the natural rhythm, seeing how we feel after, consuming certain foods. And that goes to the mind, being mindful of when we're eating, being present, being in community, even eating with our hands and what that might look like, breath work, practicing a lot of self-compassion. I think many of us at some point, if not currently, have had some type of like shame or guilt as it relates to a relationship of food and nourishment. And so being more intentional and aware of that. And then thinking about our spirit and taking care of ourselves in that way, and bringing back some of those ancestral practices of really having gratitude or prayer before our meals, and really taking time to acknowledge the process that it took for this food to make it to our plates, those that prepared it, honoring our ancestors, the land, sharing food in community, feeding others. I think we're in times where, there's a lot of shame and people are going hungry. And so in whatever capacity we can practice that, rebringing food as ceremony, if that's part of our practice. And then, the center being the land, the thing that bridges all of this together. Maybe like what Danny said, getting ready to grow your own garden or herbs or at home, whatever that might look like, and getting to know your local native plants, supporting local farmers. So just, wanted to kind of ground ourselves with that information. When we think about, colonization and the impacts of that, and even what we're navigating right now, it has left us deeply fractured and traumatized. And so I think this model and this relationship and reconnection with food can be a place to start, realigning, finding harmony, and creating that sense of like wholeness within ourselves. And so just wanted to share that with you all. I will pass it over. Oh, no, next slide, but I still have that where we can begin to talk about food sovereignty and cultural preservation. So not only taking care of ourselves individually and how that relates to our collective care, but then as we think about, okay, this has been our history, this is what we're navigating, how can we reimagine what our relationship to the food and land looks like in our community? So I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with food sovereignty. So really thinking about taking back that power from our food systems. So that includes deciding how our food is grown, how it's distributed, those traditions, holding space for that, passing those down, and really centering food justice at this is why we're here today, addressing those inequalities in our own ways, in our own communities. And before I pass it over to Danny, I just wanted to share an example of how we're doing that, how we did that recently this past year. On this slide, we have an image of one of our events that we did. I think there was like 30 of us. We did a farm to table dinner that actually all of us were there. Stephanie actually flew out to join us as well. We had the fundraiser at Cedillo's Fresh Produce in Inglewood, if folks are familiar. Cedillo's is a Latino-owned family farm. They're growing not only food, but also culturally relevant food. And we were able to bring our community together to share a plant-based meal that was rooted in our traditions. We had a local chef and his staff. I think it was Urban. Do you remember, Daniela? The
Urban
urban
Pilon.
Pilon, yeah, I was gonna misremember that, but Puerto Rican food and just other culturally relevant food based on like what was growing on the land, and then to be outside on like a nice summer day, like for many of us, like that was really healing. And we were talking about food justice, food sovereignty, reimagining that, and we were able to raise funds not only for our community fridge in Little Village, but then also Watermelon Sisters. That is a volunteer-led organization providing food access in Gaza. And so even holding space for, local reimagining here and supporting our local food systems here, but then also abroad and globally, and knowing the importance of that. And so that's just like an example of like what we did to kind of inspire some ideas for you all. And then I'll hand it over to Dani to actually close us out with other ideas that we can do as we decolonize our plates and foodways.
Yeah, so we definitely want to
Next slide, please. Thank
leave
you.
room for questions and for us to engage a bit more in conversation. I know that this is the last session of the day too, so if folks want to stick around, like we'd really love that. But yeah, so in to kind of just go through this slide, when we talk about decolonizing our plates, it's bigger than personal choices. It's about how we connect with each other, how we connect with the systems that shape our food. So this work is really about healing together, creating spaces where everyone can be nourished and supported. And it also means asking ourselves hard questions and collaborating with folks on solutions, and then knowing when to lean on others, and how to really like nourish and sustain our communities. And on an individual level, we can think about our personal habits as a form of everyday resistance and care. We can bring intentionality to our meals by knowing where our food comes from and growing meaningful plants, like Gary mentioned, that can deepen our connection to our culture and ancestry. On a family and community level, food is a tool for building relationships and sharing knowledge. I think about potlucks and how those are the events where we make the most connections with folks. And there are easy ways to just gather a bunch of community members to eat together. And we can do this by hosting meals, planting together, cooking together, or participating in local programs that strengthen community bonds and also help revive our cultural traditions. On a more collective system level, beyond personal and local actions, we can support movements that challenge inequalities, and restore land and food sovereignty. We can also amplify impact across communities by educating others, joining cultural preservation efforts, or advocating for more fair food systems. And the last thing that I'll leave you all with is every step, whether small or large, it really links individual care to collective change. And the goal isn't necessarily perfection. The goal is connecting individual choices to community care and systemic change. So I'd love for you all to consider one action that you can take this week to connect with a local organization or community effort. It could be something as small as getting to know your neighbor. Sadly, we live in a world where that's not our local world here, where that's not necessarily encouraged, and it's not very, very much of value here. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And as we begin to wrap up, we'd love the opportunity to hear from folks' personal connections to these topics. We have posed two questions here. If folks feel called to, we'd love to hear from maybe one or two folks that can unmute and share with us your answer to these questions that we're posing. The first question is, what is one ancestral food, practice, or relationship to land that you want to reclaim? And what support or resources do you need from your community? Yeah, if anyone would like to unmute and share, we'd really love to hear from y'all.
This is Marcella. Excuse me. Sore throat. I think for me, I would really like to reclaim cooking with indigenous ingredients from where my family is from, in Mexico. And I definitely need support in just my cooking skills. It's an area that I'm still working
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marcela. Yeah, and thank you for helping us keep that chat active too. We really love to hear it. Anyone else would like to share, or Estefania or Cari?
Yeah, I can share. I think more so for me, not I think for me, I'm thinking more of like the practices and the relationships. And I think like just starting with like trading seeds, cooking for our neighbors, growing, doing our best, right, with the access and the resources that we have to growing the majority of our foods. We mentioned earlier in the chat about just how lonely it can be sometimes, right, to eat and not be eating in community. So trying to have, maybe a weekly or a monthly gathering with folks where we can like, have these conversations and have it as a potluck based event where we can all bring different foods and share things like that. So I think, yeah, just really keeping community, I think, at the forefront is something that I'm always trying to reclaim for myself because I think that, we have just been so embedded in this like very like individualistic society of like we do things alone. We go to the supermarket, we get our food, we cook for ourselves, and it's like that's not how it should be. So I think keeping community at the forefront is very important for me.
Hi, Valentina. Thank you for participating. We'd love to hear from you.
Hola. I think one thing that I'm super excited about this summer is like figuring out a way to, I think growing food in general, obviously, but I think that's a bit harder, like because of like space in general. I live in a really tiny apartment on the north side. So like sunlight, like right now my basil's like, not thriving. And I feel like I kind of really want to start with like trying to be a bit more consistent with herbs, like finding a way to grow them like in abundance and dry them over the summer so that I feel like I'm having like a consistent like year-round relationship with the plant in a way that I can like, okay, I grew this over the summer when at least I had some sun, and now like I can keep using it as medicine throughout the winter, and like the fall months. So I think that's something like I'm really looking forward to because in the summer I feel very connected to like, trying to grow food and stuff like that, even though it's not always regularly successful, volunteering here and there. But then I think like, it gets cold and it's all over. And then it's like it only feels like a couple months in the year I have that relationship, and I don't know, it feels like a little imposter syndrome too, like working in the food systems and like not really interacting with the land like as much as I would want to. So I think I'm really excited for finding like ways to do that and finding like ways to connect with people on the north side, like through growing food. Because I know a lot of most efforts that I'm like, yes, oh my God, like this is so great. I love you. And like it's a bunch of like also like Latinas like are on the south and west side. So like I'm trying to like find people in places on like the north side. And I think I'm excited for Friday to meet people in person and like hopefully find like somebody who's living on the north side who like has a plot or like whatever like the local um community garden kind of thing. But yeah, and I'm excited to see everybody on this call on Friday if they can be there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually in Belmont Creek, and so yeah, let's connect tomorrow. I don't grow too much, but I'd love to, if you have any resources to share, I'd love to hear too what you're able to find here. And yeah, I think that's a great point too, like just like not having access all year long, but being able to dry out your herbs. That's a way that we can kind of get a bit of that throughout the rest of the year when it's cold. Okay, I see one more hand up. Yesy.
Hello, you all. Do you hear me?
Hey, Yesy.
Hi, all. I'm in culinary school. I'm actually in class right now. This was amazing to attend. As I've been in culinary school, I've been in this process of learning how to cook for myself, as a form of like being on a recovery journey with my body, with my hormones, really learning how to cook and eat seasonally and based off of the seasons of our bodies as we move through. Our body needs different nutritional needs at each of our different four hormonal cycles. So that's been at the forefront of the work that I'm doing of connecting the body to the land and the seasons. I'm in a process now of like planning an apothecary for 2026. And I'm really excited. I loved everything that was spoken about here. It's very necessary. And now, as a culinary student, I am really interested in offering my skills to do farm to table work this year, like seasonal cooking, and talking more about what this journey has been like and going to culinary school. My next steps are my nutrition certifications, and birthwork training. To be able to like really integrate this all further. So I'm in international cooking right now, and we're finishing up Mexico. And that has been really beautiful to think about like pre-colonial ingredients.
Oh, thank you so much for being here while still multitasking and being busy. And it's so great to see you again. Hopefully we can connect sometime.
Yeah, I'll be there tomorrow.
Yay.
So
Okay, we'll see
looking
you.
forward to that.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, I know we're coming close to time, so we'll just skim through the next few slides. The next slide here has some helpful tools and resources. We definitely want to give a shout out to our partners that you can see here who help facilitate mutual aid, local food access, and community support, such as the Love Fridges, Cedillo's Fresh Produce, which some folks are already familiar with, and that's amazing. We love Dulce. And also Pueblo Eats, that helps us to facilitate those mutual aid opportunities and getting food into the fridge and other fridges. We also have an online cookbook called Manteniendo Nuestra Cultura, which translates to maintaining or preserving our culture. I don't see it here, but we also have a bilingual children's book on mutual aid called ¿Qué necesitas? What do you need? And that's like a great way to get the kids involved because this is cross-generational work that we should be doing. So yeah, next slide. And lastly, thank you all so much for joining us today. We're grateful for your time, for your interest in this conversation, for keeping the chat alive. Please stay connected with us. You can follow us on socials, on Instagram at Veggie Mijas Chicago and also Veggie Mijas, our national account. You can send us an email at veggiemijas.chicago@gmail.com. Our collaborations are really at the heart of what we do. So if you want to reach out to co-host a workshop or an event, we'd really love that. Also, opportunities to volunteer include Sandwich Club, and we have some more information on our socials about that. It's every first Sunday of the month. And you can also clean or stock the fridge if you're around. We're also planning to organize more volunteer opportunities. And again, so much gratitude to everyone for being here. And that concludes our presentation. We'd love to open up the floor for any questions and also give some experts in the room an opportunity to respond directly to one another. If you can stay behind for a few minutes, we'd really love that. And feel free to just unmute yourself if you have a question or comment or just a question for someone else in the room.
Thank you so much, Veggie Mijas, for your incredible presentation. The information you shared and everything you discussed was not only just beautiful, but your presentation and slides and graphics were also gorgeous, as always. Thank you so much for your time, for the dedication to the work that you guys do, and the wealth of knowledge that you're sharing with us. It's very exciting work, and I'm excited to see many of you folks in person tomorrow. Also, shameless plug, after the summit, we will be gathering at Mars Brewery with our friends and folks at Knife and Northern Illinois Young Farmers. Anybody wants to join us, if you're not able to attend the whole summit or you're in a part of the summit itself, you can join us after for happy hour and celebrations. Alina released a poll, so please submit your feedback. If you can, if you're able to, all the feedback that we have, good and bad, is welcomed and appreciated. It'll help us improve our tech and just overall how we run the summits in the future.